Hello, everyone. Welcome to Carbonetic Channel. Always a pleasure to meet with you guys. Bad news, Brent, this week. We've heard in the last few days that the fire season is already started in British Columbia, also in Alberta. We're early May, and already it's going into the news, especially around Fort Nelson, where I think it's one of the most impressive fires happening right now at the time we speak. So, what's going on in there? What's your take so far on this one?
Yeah, I think initially we'd been led to believe that perhaps it was the zombie fire issue, which is still an issue where fires burning from last year never went out completely, got insulated by snow, continued to burn, sort of in the forest floor, and found enough oxygen to survive. And then with a quick snow melt and warmer spring, less snowpack, these fires got reactivated. Turns out the mayor of Fort Nelson is his name's Rob Fraser, and he's indicating that in fact the Parker Lake fire, the one that's threatening Fort Nelson currently, and it's just literally a couple kilometers away from the town. It's grown to sort of 4,000 hectares plus. It sounds like it was started by a tree that blew over onto a power line. They had high winds in the community. They're currently experiencing high winds, and that's what we see is the small fire gets out of control quite quickly because wind pushes the fire, and fire can travel extraordinarily fast, and that's what's happening right now. So right now, the talk is that the fire is about almost 17 square kilometers in size. That's as of a few days ago. Now it's even larger. 6,000 hectares is sort of what's being batted around, or 10,000 plus acres for those of you that aren't familiar with a hectare. So it's a real challenge, and our hearts go out to the folks at Fort Nelson, and particularly Fort Nelson First Nation. We've been talking with them for a long time about doing a carbon project. And here's what's happening. And we don't want to say use it or lose it, because that's very callous.
Yeah.
But British Columbia has a history of a robust forest industry. Because of politics, forestry hasn't really been practiced in any significant capacity in Fort Nelson for the past 20 years. And there's a number of circumstances that have led to that challenge. But here we have the case of, industrial corridor logging can actually act as a buffer to protect communities. And we think when those are done in the context of carbon projects, you can actually cut down or avoid a lot of this risk. So what you have here is an unmanaged forest that's being driven by the wind. And once a tree catches on fire and you have wind, you've got a recipe for disaster. And if we go back to that theory around the wildfire triangle, where we have heat, fuel, and oxygen, we have to remove one of those components. Well, of course, with high winds, we've got all the oxygen we need, so we can't remove that. We've got heat because it's a warm spring and fire creates its own weather system. So all we're really left with is fuel. So if we're able to remove fuel as a buffer, if we're able to train the fire to move faster by doing thinning, pruning, increasing the ability for the fire to avoid getting in the crowns and really get pushed by the wind, that's something we can do. And of course, the benefit in carbon sequestration is that it improves the performance of the sequestration of a tree. So we're watching this. These are projects that could have been completed in the community to bring wildfire resilience, and instead we might have a wholesale disaster. So it's really tragic. Fort Nelson First Nation gets this. Chief Charlene Gale understands this, and Jim Hodgin from Daytai, their development corporation that we talked to, he understands this. There's frustration. They were trying to do salvage harvest from the burn last year. It's taken a long time to get a depermitting. So this is a wake-up call for those who are sitting in government, sitting on their hands and not approving carbon projects that can actually address issues like this. Again, we don't want to say use it or lose it. Our hearts and our thoughts go out to the community members. Hundreds of people evacuated from their homes, sent south to an area that burnt last year, Fort St. John. So thinking about the Donnie Creek wildfire, where 3-4 million hectares of forest burned. And now here we are, early May, watching the same thing unfold. Really tragic.
Do they have manpower? I mean, about the British Columbia Forest Service, like they are the one attacking fires with firefighters, with airplanes, tankers, and such. Do they have the manpower actually in these remote areas to be able to fight efficiently, in your opinion?
No, they can never hire or have enough resources to fight Mother Nature. And
Yeah,
that's a simple
yeah,
truth. So your first line of defense is a good offense, and you create that by treating the forest properly. So putting it into the hands of people who will steward it and who will start to address these areas of interface. And as we said, one of the biggest areas of improvement that we can do in carbon is to avoid these large, damaging CO2 releasing fires. You think about Canada's emissions last year. People complain about the oil patch and the emissions associated with the oil patch. The reality is we doubled, tripled, quadrupled Canada's oil and gas exploration, production, carbon budget through forest fires last year. That's something people don't talk about. We don't actually have to account for that at the IPCC level. So we get a pass when it comes to the Paris Accord. But in reality, those emissions are still going into our airshed. And it's because we say we manage our forests, but we just simply don't. So that is the challenge. So no, you cannot hire and train enough wildland firefighters. You cannot physically buy enough Canadair bombers. You cannot physically hire enough helicopters. They just don't exist. Because it's like trying to fight it's like trying to fight a house fire with a bucket.
yeah.
It makes you feel good to know that there is a bucket, but honestly, it just does very little. And the men and women that choose to serve with dedication and bravery in the wildfire services, you have our full support and commitment. We're very pleased that there is some level of action, and that it goes on for structures protection to protect people's houses, setting up sprinklers, setting up pump stations, setting up water bladders that they can draw from, and the helicopters that are pushing on the worst areas, trying to steer the fire away from the town. But the reality is it's so out of our control when you have a fire of this magnitude and you're talking about 50, 60, 70, 80 kilometer winds in some cases. You just have no control. And what that means is if you get a dry forest, we can spell out the math, but if you get a dry forest that hasn't had any treatment, you can get the fire moving at kilometers an hour. So what that means is you take an 80 kilometer an hour wind. Well, at 25 kilometers an hour, a fire can push through 1,000 meters in minutes. So the fire can be traveling at double digit rates. It can go 5, 10, 15, 25 kilometers an hour with high wind. And what do we see in West Kelowna, where the residents of Kelowna proper felt some level of buffer because they had Okanagan Lake between them and the fire on the west side. And what happened? The fire jumped the lake.
Yeah, exactly.
So you get big embers that float up, and you've got this weather system being created where it's basically pushing or making thermal foils. And up goes the ember, and it travels across, and then it falls on an unmanaged property or a house or a cedar hedge, and boom, it's up in smoke. And that's the issue we have today. So if we measure it and we manage it, we can control some of these issues. We can't eliminate it. We still need direct action in the form of wildland firefighters, in the form of aviation assets, in the form of technology, all the good people who are involved in fire and weather modeling. Again, there's a lot of good people working on these issues, but think of it as trying to fight a house fire with a thimble.
Yeah, and there's also another component, right, which is related to wildlife. I mean, these communities, I guess, they're so remote that a lot of the indigenous living there and all the other people, um, they rely actually on hunting and fishing, and now you have a massive environmental disturbance, which probably creates some, animal migrations. And I guess that they want to leave and go somewhere else. So for years and years, I guess it becomes a scarcity of these animals that you can hunt as well, because the forest has been totally destroyed.
Yeah, quite right. I mean, I think there's a decoupling from reality, and I'll pick on the government right now. So British Columbia's government is in the most removed place it simply could be, in that the capital is in Victoria, which is below the 49th parallel on an island, and it's quite idyllic. And in fact, people move there because it's the best weather in Canada, and you're on the sea and it's beautiful. And the reality of firefighters or woodland firefighting does not really coalesce or come to Victoria, because you're on the ocean. It's beautiful. The fire risk is mid to low. And so you just get really, really out of touch with what's happening in British Columbia. And you could not pick a point in British Columbia that's really further away, Fort Nelson to Victoria. And so having our Ministry of Forests and BC Wildfire Service located there just makes no sense, because they're decoupled from the land. And we've seen time and time again, when you're decoupled from the land, you're decoupled from the reality of the land. And that's what's happening today. If the Ministry of Forests was headquartered in Prince George, which is the center of British Columbia, I think there would be a greater understanding of what these northern communities go through. But even then, folks often think about Prince George as being the capital of the north. Really, it's the dead center of the province. And we can get in a truck and drive from Victoria to Prince George, and that would take us probably about 1,000 kilometers plus the ferry ride. And then we'd be in Prince George. Well, Prince George, we'd have to drive another 3-4 hours to get to Dawson Creek. And then we're at mile 0 on the Alaska Highway. And it's another 500 kilometers. So we get to Prince George, we're not even halfway. We've got to go another 800 to 1,000 kilometers to get up into the territories we're talking to, which is one of the largest forest districts in the province. It's just absolutely massive. There's so much resources up there. The population's small, and they're just underserved, from a governmental standpoint, often ignored. Decisions go unmade because there's more pressing issues where the populations lie. And I think it's just a real mistake, and it's a crime. And that's why we see all this tragedy, because they're just not addressing the issues that are real to the residents of British Columbia that they often forget exist.
Yeah, it's no different than back, here in Kelowna, where I live. As you remember, they had a massive fire. I think at the time it was one of the biggest fire ever seen in British Columbia, right? In 2003,
In
one of the
2000,
biggest.
it was 2004
Yeah.
or 3 rather. Yeah, you're right. So it wasn't necessarily the size of the fire; it was the fact that it destroyed so many structures. So
Okay.
when we talk about size of fire, often we think about, we can have a big forest fire, and if it doesn't, we've had some big burns in the north, for instance, Yegg Fire, some of the historical fires up in the Deasley Yard area around Fort Nelson. You can burn up 1 million hectares there, and people don't really notice it because British Columbia is so huge, 945,000 square kilometers. But when it comes to damaging people's livelihoods, when it comes to taking away their homes, that's a huge problem. And we saw that in 2003, and then unfortunately again in 2023. And, the interesting thing is, if you look at the report that was done on the backs of the 2003 fire, there were specific recommendations that went to say, how do we prevent this from happening again? And most of those recommendations went unactioned. And they went unactioned in a place that actually lost homes, where firefighters were treated like conquering heroes, where there was a lot of respect given to those that dedicated their time to go in, and the amount of resources. And, Kelowna rebounded because they're resilient people. They're great people. But I would sure be frustrated if I knew that there was a report, which is publicly available.
And nothing has changed, basically, or very minimal, if
you give
anything
lip
changed.
service to the recommendations that are real, and then you see it happen again 20 years later. And this is no different than what you and I talked about last year, where carbon projects are so valuable because everybody wins and nobody loses. And this is an exact example where doing a carbon project with Fort Nelson First Nation, the first place you go to do forest improvement is, of course, around where people live. And we always talk about human interface, how many fires are human caused, and whether it's a tree blowing over on a power line, that's a completely preventable issue. That's power line companies not having a proper maintenance schedule. PG&E, if you look at it down in the States, who started those Shasta fires? Well, it was trees falling on power lines. The power lines were unmensurated, which means we didn't measure properly what was around them, didn't use proper technology which exists, didn't get out and take down trees around the area so they can't touch the line. BC Hydro, our utility in British Columbia, we have some of those same issues. Some of the utilities providers I've worked on BC Hydro projects where we found trees that were absolutely at risk of failure and could actually strike the line, not come into the limits of approach of the line, but actually hit the towers. Now they come and go in their maintenance and they try to trim things up. But if you have these power lines in areas where power is so important, communications are so important, you have to treat those issues properly and you have to remove the risk. And it feels expensive to remove the risk, but now look at the result. If you lose the community of Fort Nelson, if you lose the community of Fort Nelson First Nation, the costs are incalculable to put those communities back together. Look at the Texas wildland fires. Estimates are going to be over $1 billion. I think 12,000 cattle were killed through that fire. And it got going and got out of control at an unprecedented rate. We're just not doing the work, but we have the tools available to address these situations. Yeah. Fort McMurray, another situation where, here are the recommendations, here are the things you need to do. 5,500 hectare fire out of control within, 10, 15 kilometers of the town. Again, what are we doing?
Fort McMurray fire was like, what, 5 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 7.
Yeah, 15, 16, 17, something like that. Yeah, not a long time ago. Yeah, in the late aughts or teens. And now it's a big fire and it's out of control and it's close to the community. Again, we have tools. Our friends in the forest harvest community, they're looking for fiber. They're looking for areas of opportunity. The policies have changed so dramatically in British Columbia. We're really suffering right now in industry. Put industry to work, building resilience around these communities. Couple them with carbon projects that increase the sequestration potential of the forests around these communities. Let's get ahead of this because it's just going to keep on occurring. And the last thing we want to see is obviously loss of life. We had 3 fatalities that I know of, and I could be mistaken, there could be more, but certainly 3 fatalities last year during last year's fire season. This one's starting out to actually be another record fire season. How many people are going to have to die before we change things up?
Yeah.
So that's not to speak of the loss of houses, the loss of businesses, the losses of livelihood, as well as all that polluting carbon. We don't even know the long-term health consequences.
And sometimes we underestimate, the role of the boreal forest acting worldwide. When I have conversation with our experts in Europe, and they're talking about how critical the boreal forest is, for playing his role of the lungs of the planet. And of course, you've got the Amazonian forest, you've got many others around the globe, but they cannot all be focused on one place while the planet itself is pretty big. And the boreal forest, it plays a critical part of, our lifestyle as human beings on the planet. and create that oxygen that we need. And now not only it's burning, but now you have that massive, carbon release back in the atmosphere. And again, as you said, it was preventable, right? So it could be improved, and let's keep on working on it. Do you have a last comment before we end the video today, Brent?
Yeah, and to your point about the boreal forest, Canada has 28-30% of the boreal forest of the world. That top band that sort of runs, if we're thinking about the globe, through Northern Europe, places like Norway, Sweden, and then out through to Russia, which would have the bulk of it. So there's a large percentage that's in our control. 60% or upwards of 60% of Canada has boreal forest on it. And about 80% of our boreal forest is relatively still intact. But these wildfire issues are killing our trees. They're not coming back the same. We've seen that firsthand. We see over-densified pine stands that just need a helping hand to get going. So we have tools available to fix it in a very ecologically and sustainably practiced way. We can get these forests going again, help them grow, help them take up some of the slack. And we just have to come up with theory to prevent the massive wholesale fire events that we've been seeing as of late, particularly because of the warming of the planet, and the planet's been, again, climate change, the planet's been hotter, the planet's been cooler in history. Humans are less resilient to the change than the planet is. Our issue is it's never gotten this hot, this fast in recorded human history. And we're seeing that right on the backs of the worst wildfire season we've seen in a long time. 2023, we're right into it again in 2024. We have some tools to address these things, and we're just not seeing it happen. So again, my comment is we have tools in the toolbox to fix this. We just need government support in the form of Indigenous Atmospheric Benefits Agreement that give us the right to practice these projects on the land with our Indigenous partners, as well as as well as getting the projects going, standing these things up at scale, getting rid of the bureaucracy and the red tape, because we're just going to see more of this, and it's tragic. And we also encourage the provinces and the territories that don't have the ability to practice carbon projects on Crown land, or unceded Aboriginal land, as we'd like to refer to it. Let's get with the program. We're open to help supporting governments. Alberta's got an issue, clearly. Saskatchewan, to a lesser extent, Manitoba, Ontario, obviously Quebec. We're doing lots of good work there, trying to support that conversation. The Maritimes, lots of private managed land, perhaps not as big an issue. But certainly YTG, we're talking to them. Northwest Territories, none of it. I mean, all of this is important. So how we move this conversation forward is crucial to how we go forward as humanity and protect the ability of the boreal forest to clean the air of the world. So really important stuff. And our thoughts, our prayers, whatever we can do to support the community of Fort Nelson and other folks that are struggling, hit us up. If there's something we can do that's in our capacity, we'll certainly be happy to help. And hopefully it's a carbon project so that we can get ahead of this.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Brent, for your time. Always appreciated, and your expertise. I know you've been working in that area as well for years and years. So it's an area of British Columbia that you know extremely well. And thank you, guys. Thank you, all the viewers, once again today on our channel. And let's see you next week for the next video that we will create for you guys. So thanks again. Have a great week, all. Brent, always a pleasure. Take good care.
You too.
Let's talk later.
Thank you for watching this video. If you care about the forest as much as we do, please subscribe to our different channels and stay put for the next one.